I thought I was going to stay in New York. And I was home for Christmas when these guys were starting the Pasadena Weekly, literally 2 weeks after I'd come home for Christmas. And they asked me to join them. And that's how I came back to Pasadena.
Welcome to the SGV Master Key, a show where you will hear personal stories of triumph over failures and how others successfully navigated the unique landscape that is the San Gabriel Valley. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we have chosen the San Gabriel Valley for our home or businesses or both. We believe it is the people and small businesses that make this community great, and we love to share their stories with you. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at sgvmasterkey.com. Here are the hosts for the show, Russell Mono and Scott Warmoth.
All right, welcome back to the SGV Master Key. Thanks for tuning in and spending this time with us. We're excited to bring you another guest and hope that you find something very interesting from our show. Today is a very special day. Do you know why it's special, Scott?
It's my birthday.
It is. That's right. So happy birthday, Scott.
Thank you.
I know you don't enjoy the attention or people drawing.
I don't publicize it. Yeah, that's right.
But this is a special day, and I'm excited to be here with you on this day. So.
Yeah, thank you.
But we've gone over your history on the show and the things that you've been involved with, and that sort of ties in with our guest today. Can you share some about that?
Well, growing up, newspapers were just the big thing in my life. And when I was a kid, of course, I had a paper route and, newspapers were big. But my father had been in newspapers. He was a writer, reporter, and it greatly influenced me. So my father, I would go down as a kid and look at some of the old newspapers that he might have saved from when he was writing and just look at what, he did. And when I graduated from high school, which was 1973, I became the sports editor and a reporter for our weekly newspaper in the town I grew up in. And I did that for a couple of years, then went on to work for a daily newspaper and kept going until I worked at the New York Times. And I thought newspapers were going to be my life, I mean, I just loved it. I mean, newspapers were sort of the heart of the community. And today we have a little different sort of take on newspapers. It's not as important in a sense as I saw it growing up. A lot of young kids today don't even read newspapers. And I just, I miss those good old newspaper days. But I decided to go on to law school and I became a lawyer eventually. But
yeah, I can see it now. And I don't know if the listening audience can hear it, but there's this spark that comes out from you when you start to talk about newspapers.
Yeah. Newspapers, it's just, like I said, it was my whole life. And,
sure.
I can take you into my little office here and show you, just some of the things I wrote and some of the things I have saved over the years. Just newspapers to me, to this day, are a special thing to me. And that's why I'm so excited about today's guest, because from the day we were able to hook him, I've looked forward to this.
Yes.
And just looking at his background, which I didn't know the whole story at that time, is just an incredible background, because he's a fourth generation Pasadenan and has been involved, it looks like since the 70s. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't read it anymore, but with the Pasadena Star News and subsequent newspapers in connection with the Southern California News Group.
Yeah, 80s for the Star News.
80s.
But there were little papers in Pasadena in the 70s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And let's welcome the current public editor of the Pasadena Star News, Larry Wilson.
Well, thanks very much, Scott.
Yeah.
So nice to be with you.
Yeah, it really is a pleasure. And I know you probably go back to the hot type days.
At the Pasadenan, what you're talking about, paper routes you had when you were a kid, and the Pasadenan was a weekly in the 60s, and it had been for decades. And I don't think that Harry Smith, who ran it, and I grew up in Pasadena until we moved to Prospect Boulevard when I was 14, but in Pasadena. But I grew up way up against the mountains off Loma Alta in Pasadena in the 50s and 60s, and graduated high school same year you did.
Right, I see that.
But the Pasadenan was a free weekly, and Harry Smith, who owned it for many years, had a hot type. He had the melting down device with this big cauldron in the back of it. I don't think by that point, when we were delivering it when I was 13 or so, I think he had some slightly more modern system. Yeah. But I saw a hot type capable.
Well, I worked at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which was a Hearst newspaper daily, and I started working there actually in the early 70s, even before I graduated from high school, and they still had the hot type at that point. So hot type was lead. It was like melted lead.
Right, and it melted at a relatively low temperature, and so we're really going into the weeds about these things, the thing we love, newspapers, and the fact that it used to be printed like that. And as you say, our kids, to the extent they read a newspaper, very rarely is it the kind that rubs off on your hands with the ink.
Yes, right, yeah. But your story also is just your family history here in Pasadena is 4 generations.
Yeah, my grandmother's parents, who I never knew, John Veale, Veale Wilson. John was born in the back parking lot of Parsons, so right above, right around Walnut and Fair Oaks. And now that's being, of course, developed. I think there's still a little tiny bit of the Parsons parking lot there. And her father worked across the street in what is now One Colorado, and he was a farrier. He put horseshoes on, because that was a stables where One Colorado is. I think I'm going to go over to J. Crew after we tape and return some T-shirts. but that was in my grandmother's day, stables. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you grew up here, graduated from Blair High School?
I did. I graduated from Blair in 73, but Muir, I always have to shout out to, because I spent my first year and a half at John Muir High School and really became part of that culture. Muir is a hallowed institution. And Blair at that time in the 70s was still brand new, 4 or 5 years old. And I transferred there for complicated reasons having to do with a girl. And there was a funny little operation at Blair that was called Evening High School, and we went to school from 4:30 to 9:30 at night, Monday through Thursday. They knew nobody would stay late at night on a Friday, and so that was at Blair. And then I transferred to Blair Day School after one semester, which was the most wonderful semester of my high school life, because it was an endless party. But I figured if I was going to get into, because you get out of school at 9:30 at night and you don't have to be back at school until 4:30 the next day. You don't have a curfew. It was lovely. So evening high school was another very important part of my education. And Paul Fano, who founded it, was like a weirdo private academy that was half hippies. And this was 70,
right,
72,
early 70s, yeah,
and half people who really did want to or have to get a job at the gas station or at the grocery store and could work during the day and then get to school at 4:30 at night. And it was fabulous, but fabulously fun.
Yeah, you obviously have a really deep connection here with the San Gabriel Valley, and we're always looking to explore that with the guests. But I'm interested, when did your love for newspaper and what you do now, where did that develop?
I was a reader, and I learned to read with my dad by reading the newspaper when I was 3 and 4, and we'd get the Star News in the evening back then, the paper that I went on to become the editor of. So that was the afternoon daily, and then we'd get the LA Times in the morning, and I would read with my dad, both after he got home from work with the Star News, the local local rag and the Times in the morning. And so I loved it. I was editor of the Husky Highlights, which was the junior high school paper at Elliott Junior High up on Lake in Altadena. But then in high school, I didn't work on the school paper at all. And any writing I did, I guess, was in English class. But when I got up to Berkeley, I joined the Daily Californian, the student newspaper there, where I'm now, weirdly enough, the chairman of the board of the trustees that operate the nonprofit paper. But I had gone in my freshman year at Berkeley and said, I want to work for the Daily Cal. And they said, oh, do you have like 20, 25 hours a week? And I said, no, God, it's really hard for me to study. I've got to study, it's like going to college. I considered it a full-time job. But I went in the next year, my sophomore year, and said, I really dislike the rock music critic. And I just don't think he's a good writer. And the editor, the arts editor, who was a graduate student, said, I don't like him either. And I said, oh, well, why do you run him? She goes, well, it's who I got. She goes, here's an assignment. I went to cover something, live show. And she liked my work, and he left, and I came in. And so I was the rock music critic for 3 years at the Daily Cal, which was a great thing to be in mid-'70s to late 70s, 74 to 77 Berkeley, because I got to interview Patti Smith and all these bands, go see the Grateful Dead in the 70s in their element. So
that was the Bay Area was at its peak kind of there.
It was a good time.
60s, 70s.
Yeah, it was a good time to be a rock music critic. So that's how I got that. That's how I learned to write. I learned to write at the Daily Cal, and by writing, criticism, reviews, interviews, and didn't really get into the hard news side ever until I was a reporter at the Pasadena Weekly in the early 80s here, when I covered City Hall and
I see that you also were one of the founders of the Weekly.
I was on the business side. I'm very interested to hear sometime about your New York Times experience, and then the law school thing. I went away from newspapers for a while, and I decided as an English major at Berkeley, I needed to. I'd never even taken an economics class, for God's sake. And so I went and got a master's in management, a master's in international management at Thunderbird.
I saw you went to Thunderbird.
Yeah, school in Phoenix.
Right.
Outside of Phoenix. In Glendale.
Which is one of the leading schools, if not the leading school in that particular
It was this focus
area.
On the international thing was a deal. And now they have an MBA, but the degree back then was called Master's in International Management. I really realized halfway through that I really wanted to be in newspapers or publications of some kind. So, but I just kept up and got the degree, and then came back to publications. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I had a lot of friends who went to Thunderbird around that time too, because I had come out of the Peace Corps, and that was a big draw for a lot of Peace Corps and that type of person.
And I had come back from I had got a writing job for Parsons, speaking of Parsons, Ralph M. Parsons Engineering, which is a Pasadena company. And I got a job here in Pasadena right out of Berkeley. And they had a big project in Saudi Arabia. And they said, would you like to go to Saudi Arabia? And I said, no. Are you crazy? And then they said, well, we'll double your salary. And you can travel a lot. And so I got interested in travel and in international business while I was working in Saudi for 1.5 years. And that's why I went to Thunderbird. I thought, but then I never became a real business executive or anything, but I did have this graduate degree in business.
Yeah.
So they hired me when the folks who were starting the Pasadena Weekly, Rick Cole, former mayor of Pasadena, who was then on the city council, and Pierce O'Donnell, who was a local attorney who had run for Congress, and he's big LA attorney now. So, and a bunch of other people. They asked me to be the business manager, and that lasted for about 1 year, because I'm not really a CPA, and that's what we needed. So, but then they did great. I was grateful that they let me stay on, and I became assistant editor of the paper, which basically was doing some editing, but mostly reporting. And it was a great time in Pasadena newspapering, by the way. I mean, the Pasadena Weekly still exists, 36 or whatever it is years later. It has a very, very small staff, and we had a dozen full-time journalists. We hired away the City Hall reporter from the Pasadena Star-News, Dick Lloyd, to be our reporter, our City Hall reporter and city editor. And had Steve Call was the original managing editor. Steve, I mean, that is crazy because Steve is head of the Columbia Journalism School now, the Graduate School of Journalism, is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and was the managing editor of the Washington Post, Pulitzer Prize winner, of course, for his foreign correspondence. Anyway, there was this great
and all those people came out of the Pasadena Star-News.
Well, that was the weekly,
or I'm sorry, the weekly.
That was the weekly, but people, Rick Cole,
you've got a mayor or a city manager. You've got
right.
Pulitzer Prize winners.
Yeah, it was a good time, as I say, in Pasadena journalism, and it was a time that it probably was still insane to start a newspaper. We way over. We spent way too much money for a couple of years, but it was within the realm of possibility. Now, nobody in their right mind would start a newspaper, at least if you thought it was going to make money.
Right.
If a nonprofit might do it. We were crazy kids 36 years ago. So, and then the Star News hired me away a couple of years later.
So today, can you describe what your title is, what you do now?
Right.
And it's in juxtaposition to back then.
After years of being, I was the editorial. They hired me as the editorial page editor when Hall Daly left to go to Caltech, and they needed a local yokel who knew something about Pasadena. It was a Knight Ridder paper back then, and so it was part of a big chain of really good papers all around the country. And they tended to people. It was a destination for on the way up editors from the Miami Herald and Philadelphia Inquirer, and people would come to the Star News. It was very innovative technologically. We were in a 5-story building,
right down on Colorado.
Still says Star News in marble on it. 5-story building. We had 210 employees back then in like 85, 86. And, printed in the basement right there. Mm-hmm. And it was a big time operation. So I was the editorial page editor for 5 or 7 years. Then I was the editor for 12 years. And then for the last 7 or 8 years, my title has been public editor. And that was overseeing the editorial pages of the Whittier Daily News, the San Gabriel Valley Tribune, and the Star News. Then these mergers, now, Southern California News Group is basically every daily in Southern California that isn't the Times, with a little asterisk, the Signal, the Newhall Signal. Is an independent newspaper. But
that's what really struck me. And I didn't realize that this had happened. And somehow in the last few years, every daily newspaper other than the Times has been incorporated into...
So it was, we bought our parent company back east in Denver, bought the Orange County Register. But the Orange County Register was actually a much bigger paper, and they had a huge editorial board. I think we had 11 people on the editorial board right about 5 years ago when we bought the Register. But so buying the Register also meant buying the Riverside Press Enterprise. And we already had the San Bernardino Sun, the Ontario Daily Bulletin, the Whittier and San Gabriel and Pasadena papers, the LA Daily News, the Long Beach Press Telegram, and the Torrance Daily Breeze. I must be skipping something, but not much. So
Riverside, did you have the
Riverside Press Enterprise, and also the Redlands Daily Facts. So that's all these wonderful old, founded in almost all of them, not the Tribune in San Gabriel, that was in San Gabriel Valley, was founded in 55, but most of the rest of them were, had these 19th century pedigrees. Star News was founded the same year this city we're in right now, Pasadena, was incorporated, 1886. So the Star News and the city of Pasadena really grew up together, literally founded in the same year.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And I know for many of the younger people, they just can't grasp, what our memories of newspapers were. But as you mentioned, 210 employees at the Pasadena Star News, and that was in the 90s?
Yeah, that was in the 80s and 90s, yeah.
And you had a 5-story building that was... Do you remember, Russell? Do you know that Pasadena Star News building?
I don't know the building, but I'm old enough to remember the paper and reading the paper, and now I see most of what I see of Pasadena Star News is online.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, and that's fine. But it's of course, the plain fact is that the influence back when we were sort of the only game in town was vastly different. I mean, there's just to personalize it for a moment. I mean, we're talking personally here. There's probably, let's say, since 2000 or so, when readership was declining at papers all over the country. I mean, the fact that I was the editor of the Star News, man, I just thought that was the greatest thing on earth. And the fact is, people would recognize you walking down the street because they saw your picture in the paper. I mean, I've had a column in the paper for once a week, and then 3 times a week, and now twice a week for 36 years. And so, people, have grown up, obviously, and are getting older, in the time that I've been doing that. And, but now nobody says to me in the supermarket anymore, hey, you're Larry Wilson, I see your picture in the paper, because they don't see my picture in the paper.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I was growing up, reporters were like superstars,
right.
You think who was covering the local baseball team,
Sure.
You knew the name, you'd see his picture writing a column every day or once a week.
Yeah,
or whatever.
Jim Murray was a superstar in LA, but so were the Star News people. Chuck Chernus, my predecessor on the editorial pages at the Star News, who later ran his column for many years after I was editor. Chuck was probably the most recognizable person in town. He drove around town in a golf cart. He had polio in the 50s, but he had a cool golf cart that he parked right in front of the Star News, and everybody knew him, and he was the podcaster of his day.
Well, they were really the heart. Newspapers were the heart of the community, whether it was a weekly newspaper in a smaller town or a daily newspaper in a large city or a huge national newspaper, but they were the heart of that community. People would, go to call a newspaper for answers to questions.
Yeah,
and
that's right. We were sort of like the library.
It was like you were expected to know everything.
And at a big paper, I was a copy messenger, which was a copy boy, but there was boys and girls. So at the LA Times in the late 70s, and that was the peak of the Times' influence. It was a huge paper that was starting to compete with the New York Times and the Washington Post, and had a huge Washington bureau. And anyway, all the nut calls that would come into the paper, which were dozens a day, they'd feed them into the copy messenger's room, and you had to answer the phone. And you literally be talking to people who were talking to space aliens through their teeth, through the cavities,
right.
The fillings in their teeth. That was a very common one. I talked to a number of people and had nutty political theories, and they didn't want to. The operators didn't want to hang up on these folks and have a bad image of the paper. So they said, send it to the copy messengers. And yeah, you're right. But people would call up, and before you could Google things, it was like calling the information desk at the library. People would want to know, how many home runs Carl Yastrzemski hit. And
yeah, and
sometimes you could tell them.
They would call and ask for, ball game scores. Who won this game, or what's the score of this game? And
that's right.
There was no way for them to get that information.
That's right. They could be listening to say a Dodgers game, whatever, on KFI, but if they didn't listen, hadn't heard the news at the top of the hour or whenever the sports news came on, you had to call the Pasadena Star News.
Yeah. Well, we finally at the PI, Seattle PI, in the sometime in the 70s, we then diverted those, people calling for scores to a score line. So we recorded like every 10 minutes, all the ball score, all the scores.
So you could just say, "Here, go listen to this," and
so they could call that directly, and they'd get all the scores as of that
Seattle
day.
People were always high tech.
Yeah, that's right.
You had a tech solution.
Yeah, we're always more advanced than others. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, look at the creativity that has come out of that town.
It's a city that I hardly recognize now. I go back all the time. When I grew up, it was Boeing, you know, and that was it. But now, I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and you drive past a neighborhood where two of the richest people in the world live.
That's right.
And they're right there.
They probably have lakefront.
Yeah, right. And when I was growing up, my girlfriend lived right in that area, right where Bill Gates lives. And so I knew the street. Just amazing. But yeah, boy, we're really reminiscing, aren't we? We better get into some current.
Well, it's fun to see you guys, reminisce and speak about those things. But I'm also interested in the things that create motivation and drive in people. And you started your journey with this story or this image of you reading with your father. Did your father get to see what you've accomplished?
Oh yeah, he's 93. He lives out in Claremont. Now he grew up here and went to Pomona College, and he's always loved hanging out at Pomona, and so he moved back to Claremont to the San Antonio Gardens with his wife. Well, moved back to Claremont about 15 years ago, so he literally can audit classes, at least before the pandemic, at his old school where he was a chemist and chemistry major. So, and he also went to Claremont Graduate University for his master's, and he's I wouldn't say a frustrated writer because he's written a lot, but his career was in science and then in business, and so most of the writing that he got to do was for when he was in the Tournament of Roses, for instance. The many years he lived here in Pasadena and was in the tournament, ended up on its board of directors and chaired a bunch of committees. And back then the tournament, the all-male, of course, tournament in the 50s and 60s would have big parties, and there'd be follies, and he would write the lyrics for the musicals and stuff. And he did a lot of writing, technical writing, when in his business life because he could write. And he's always loved newspapers, and I think was proud of the fact that I went into the field.
Well, I'm sure. I mean, he must be thrilled with your career.
I know that my grandfather, Elmer Wilson, was in an old folks home and here in Pasadena when he was in his 80s, and I'm told by the ladies who worked there that he would always look at the staff box and see if my name was still there every morning. Of course, the paper came every morning, and okay, he's still got a job. And I think Elmer was my grandfather. Nobody called him grandfather, everybody called him Elmer.
Do you remember your first byline?
Well, it would have been in the Husky Highlights, yeah. It was in the Husky Highlights.
Was that a big thrill?
Yeah. I remember more the ones, the first professional newspaper that I worked for here in Pasadena was a short-lived paper, lasted 1 year, in the Green Hotel, Castle Green, called the Pasadena Guardian. And I worked there one summer in college and wrote rock music stuff there too. And I remember my first byline there was very exciting. That was
to see your name in print, that you wrote a story.
Oh yeah, it was cool.
For someone who's traveled and has, I would imagine, the ability to travel, it seems like there's a draw to come back here or remain here. What is that?
Well, so that's the weird thing about my career in journalism, in the sense that that I'm envious of somebody who got to work at the New York Times. At the same time as I'm very overall pleased with my choice of staying here and working on the little hometown daily, which is what I've done for the vast bulk of my career. I've worked other places, but 36 years at one paper at the Star News. And so, it's a very small pond. It's not the New York Times, and it's not, but I've discovered in my life that, and people will say that I go on and on about Pasadena, and the best story about that is that I was working as a very lowly fact checker at Rolling Stone Press the year I lived in New York City. And Rolling Stone magazine used to publish 4 or 5 books a year, pretty good books. They were histories of jazz music and stuff like that. So the beautiful secretary, assistant to the managing editor, Eliza Wing, and I were walking on Fifth Avenue in the greatest city in the world. I love New York. It's fantastic. Yeah. And she stopped me and she grabbed me by the shoulders and she said, "Larry, you sure talk about Pasadena a lot." Mm-hmm. I said, "I do?" And she said, "Yes, you do." And then we just kept on walking out to lunch or whatever. And it really obviously struck me. I was realizing, I guess, but I thought I was going to stay in New York. And I was home for Christmas when these guys were starting the Pasadena Weekly, literally 2 weeks after I'd come home for Christmas. And they asked me to join them. And that's how I came back to Pasadena. Maybe I too could have been at the New York Times.
Yeah, right. Well, and you would have done better than I did.
I don't know.
Well, Larry, we ask each guest to bring an item of significance with them. What did you bring today?
So it was easy to fit in the palm of my hand, and it's something very unusual because few people will have heard of it, but it's what I'm holding here. Podcast listeners can't really see it.
We do have a camera.
Oh, well, it's a little gold coin, and it's encased in this plastic, which is very odd, but maybe if it had been not encased in it, it would have been lost. But it says City of Pasadena, Incorporated, June 1886, and it was an old award called the Noble, not Nobel, but Noble Award, Noble, named after a Pasadena Arthur Noble, who was some kind of early Pasadena businessman, and it was given to my grandfather in 1940. And it was a prize that the then Board of City Directors, which is what they called the City Council, gave to the sort of Citizen of the Year kind of a thing. And Elmer, my grandfather at that point, who had come here in 1917 to go to the precursor of the Rose Bowl. It was the Rose Bowl. It was the same game. It was a college football game on January 1st, but it was in Tournament Park over there by Caltech, owned by Caltech now. And that they played a football game there. And he ran away from home in East McKeesport, Pennsylvania, to come to Pasadena on the excuse of seeing the University of Pennsylvania in this football game. What he really wanted to do was get the hell out of Pennsylvania, and where he would have been working in steel mills. And he was 17 or 18 years old. He was born in 99. So he was 17 or 18. And he stayed. He just stayed. We don't think that he graduated high school, but he may have done, but he never talked about it. And he never talked about anything back east. It was here that he became a shoe salesman and an insurance salesman and a ticket salesman eventually when they opened up the Civic Auditorium in 26, and maybe a little earlier, maybe 24, Pasadena Civic Auditorium on Green Street. And so he sold tickets and was an usher, and he went on to become the impresario. He booked the whole auditorium from the 30s until the mid to late 70s. Wow. And he was never a city employee. He was always a sole proprietor. They ended up just giving him an office in there because he booked everything. It was, that was back when, talk about different mediums. There weren't travel logs on TV. There wasn't any TV. So people would come to the auditorium all the time. There was a weekly, travel log series, and people would come in and narrate them. And then symphony orchestras, and he had Eugene Ormandy and all the great orchestras if they came to Southern California, they came to the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, because this is before the Music Center was built downtown. Now, there were LA things, Shrine Auditorium and stuff, but this was the best for classical music. So he, this uneducated Scotch-Irish kid from Pennsylvania, put a tuxedo on every night. Wow. 6 nights a week usually, and was this impresario. Elmer Wilson Presents. So here he was, 41 years old, and he got this award, and they gave it, for decades, and they still were giving it when I first became a reporter here in the 80s, and then the whole thing devolved, and they just stopped. They just stopped giving it, and it became a political fight between the 7 council members over who should get it, and it became a class issue and a race issue. Most of the people got the thing were white men, like my grandfather. And it could have easily been solved in the sense that you could rotate it among the council districts and say, okay, every 7 years you get to name or your district gets, whoever is representing your council district could give it. But they wouldn't. They fought over it and they just stopped. So there's still some money, by the way. This Arthur Noble endowed, I think he gave some Southern California Edison bonds to the city. And they're still, I believe, making money in some small way. There's probably a little $40,000, something small like that, pool they could be using to give this award and have a dinner or something, but they won't do it. And so I brought it in partly because obviously I'm proud of my grandfather, but partly to show the difference in the Pasadena of today and the Pasadena of then. Pasadena was run by usually 7 white men who ran the city, and they were hand in glove with the tournament, with the Star News. This was that was who ran the city, and these were sort of middle class people. Like my grandfather became middle class. He was poor when he was a kid, but he's quite successful here, quite successful on his own terms and all. But of course the people who came to his events, and there were dances in the back. All the big bands were in the back where the ice rink is now. The wealthy people who had moved to Pasadena from the east, who were wintering here. The winter was his big season, obviously, at the Civic Auditorium. And he wasn't of that class. He wasn't in the Valley Hunt Club. He wasn't. He was in the Overland Club, which was a bunch of cigar-smoking, not that he smoked cigars, card-playing guys, hard drinkers.
Just not the high level.
No, the Valley Hunt was old money, and it was, so I'm sure that those people, the rich people, imagined that they ran the town, but this sort of, Rotary Club level running it was done by the people like Elmer, and it was a great destination, and it was, of course, a resort town, hard as it is for us to imagine today.
Well, it definitely has had always that reputation of, rich, white.
Right.
But when I moved here in the 90s, I just found Pasadena to be such a sophisticated, cultural, interesting place.
For which we can thank, I always say, Caltech. If Caltech weren't here, it would be so white bread, and so the Jewish Brooklyn and Queens scientists who came here,
including Einstein,
and so including a German Jew, Einstein, changed the culture of Pasadena radically for the better, because otherwise, as I say, it was pure white bread.
It would be Midwestern millionaires, right?
That's what it was. That's who lived on South Orange Grove Boulevard,
right?
And who had made their money in whatever, Wrigley chewing gum,
Ivory soap.
Ivory soap. But they had made their money already or inherited those companies, Gamble House, Procter & Gamble family. So they weren't really working here. They were some people worked in downtown LA law firms or whatever, but mostly they were retiring here.
But I would put Pasadena in the class of a world-class city at this point.
Oh, and I agree. And it's and having Caltech here, so small. I was reminded the other day when I was writing it down, 935 undergraduates.
Yeah.
That it's a tiny, quite a lot more graduate students than that, and a lot of people who are staff who are teaching and whatnot. But still, and a funny thing is that, little known fact, before UCLA was created and they were looking for a Southern California UC campus, they considered Pasadena and even the area right around where Caltech is now, in the whatever that was in the 20s. And think how Pasadena, what if it were UC Pasadena?
Yeah.
I think that might be a bit much for, there's a lot of similarities between Pasadena and Berkeley. Green and greenhouses, both places, powerful institute of higher learning, at the center, at the heart of the culture. Similarly sized, they were cities that, as Berkeley and Oakland are to San Francisco, Pasadena is, the neighbor of a much bigger city, Los Angeles. But if there were UC Pasadena, God, housing would be even more expensive. Imagine. The Westwood of...
right. Yeah. Well, and it's funny that, the football team plays here anyway.
Well, so that's right. UCLA, I mean, I feel sorry for UCLA.
Because it's a USC town.
Well, it's a USC town, but also, I mean, it was hard enough for me to go to a football game in college, and all I did was walk up the street.
Right.
I can't imagine driving crosstown to the Rose Bowl if I'm living in Westwood. So that's a nutty situation, but very important economically to the Rose Bowl, which has been very hard hit in this pandemic, and by the fact that UCLA's had crummy football teams for the last several years before the pandemic.
Which I'm happy about, incidentally.
An SC person, is that where you went to?
I detest USC more than I do UCLA.
Okay.
I'm Seattle, right? Washington Huskies.
There you go.
We probably have a lot of USC listeners.
We just lost,
No, exactly.
Sorry about that.
I am an honorary Trojan. I taught for 3 semesters in the journalism school.
Oh, really?
So I have my Trojan loyalties.
They do know how to read and write there?
They do.
Okay.
They do. I discovered that, and it's a tremendous school.
Well, we lose all the Lakers fans too because of Scott.
Yeah, you lose Laker and Dodger fans because of me.
Don't start talking to me about the Dodgers then.
There's so many directions we can go from here. I'm really curious, because you have this unique perspective on what you've seen as far as changes in the San Gabriel Valley or Pasadena over the years, and what you see coming on the horizon. But let's take a quick break, and we'll come right back.
The legal process can be intimidating. You don't know where to start, and you're unsure of what to expect. The attorneys and staff at the law offices of Scott Wormuth have been serving the San Gabriel Valley for over 35 years, helping people just like you navigate through the legal process and ensuring you're treated fairly. You can find them at law888.com or call 626-282-6868. That's 626-282-6868.
All right, just before the break, Scott was offending half of our listening audience.
3/4.
Yeah. But Larry, I said before the break, I'm interested on your perspective on things that have changed in the San Gabriel Valley or Pasadena and what you see on the horizon. Can you share your thoughts on that?
When I was growing up here, Pasadena obviously was, or obviously to most people, but maybe people don't know, was always an integrated city because there was a large Japanese American population in the city's northwest, right, surrounding Muir High School. When I went to Muir, it was majority black, but a significant minority, i.e. 10% were Japanese American, and African American population here and Latino population always. It was just like a little city of LA. But Arcadia was all white. La Cañada Flintridge, then just La Cañada unincorporated, all white. I mean, I'm a little bit exaggerating, but let's say 97% white. San Marino, all white. South Pasadena, same thing. So the Chinese and other Asian cultures, Korean diaspora to the San Gabriel Valley has been, the biggest change demographically in our time, and will continue to be the biggest story ethnically, culturally. That has been a sea change. Pasadena also, the biggest change to me culturally is the fact that when I was growing up here and went to the public schools, very few people didn't go to the public schools. Poly was here, Westridge was here, Flintridge Prep was here, all boys at the time. And then there was Catholic schools. But otherwise, it was a public school town, and people of all races and classes. I mean, when I went to Muir, there were millionaires' children went to John Muir. That is not the case right now. So we had a common place where we were every day, and that was a big part of the politics of the town. School board politics was how I first got involved in politics, and Pasadena was, of course, the first city outside of Dixie, literally, that had court-ordered integration. The schools, the elementary school I went to in Altadena, 365 kids, which I know because I had to run for student body president, I had to count votes. By the time I was in 6th grade, there was a young African-American girl in 1st grade. But otherwise, 364 white kids. And East Altadena was all white back then, east of Lake. Dramatically changed. Both the neighborhoods have become more integrated. Every neighborhood is now integrated. But everybody, went to the schools. And then when I went to Elliott, junior high school was majority Black and Latino elementary schools and all white elementary schools fed in together. By the time we went off to Muir, which is a famously Black culture, we were over fights, we were over animosity, we were over racial things. But those mixing years, 7, 8, and 9, it was tough. I think that I got through better because I was on the B football team in 9th grade and then was on some other sort of junior B football team in 8th grade and was in tackling drills with my, African American and Latino friends. So we got our fights out that way. Anyway, it was a completely different town because of the importance of the schools to all races and classes, which is not the case now.
Yeah, what I understand is Pasadena has a large number of private schools, and is it fair to say that the public school system here, if you come to Pasadena, you're not coming here for the public school system, you're coming for the private system?
Most people, certainly that's the case. I talked to a young woman today who has a 5-year-old, and she's sending her kid in Pasadena to a charter school in Altadena that is literally my old public school. Noyes Elementary is now Avison Charter. And so she's staying within the public system, but on the charter side of it. Yeah, I know many teachers in the district and spent a lot of time covering the district and going back to schools, and the schools are very good. But you're right. The upper middle classes are not sending their kids there. They're moving to Pasadena knowing that they're going to send their kids to private school.
I remember in 1995 when we moved to Pasadena, the seller of the house that we bought told us, we had 2 young children, said, this is a private school city, as if we were expected that, our kids would go to private schools because that's what, people of a certain demographic did.
That's right. So it's and I've been thinking about it and, working. I worked for the integration of the schools as a kid. In high school, we marched on the school board meeting, and it was back when Ray Cortinas was famously our superintendent, and then went on to be superintendent in L.A., New York, and San Francisco, and incredible educator. And so Ray kept getting fired and hired by various school boards, because pro-busing school boards would get elected, and then anti-busing school boards would get elected. And so after busing was ordered, and in fact went into effect, and that's why I went to Muir. My old home in Altadena was changed districts. That's when all the many people moved to Arcadia, many people moved to the beach, many white people moved to La Cañada Flintridge, etc. So there was white flight literally from not just the district, but from the city.
So those who live in Pasadena, I think they understand when you say South Pass or Northwest Pasadena or East Pasadena, that they're not really separate parts of the city, but you refer to them because there are differences. So you've probably experienced or seen the changes, especially in Northwest Pasadena. What are your thoughts on why that area seems to be the way that it is now?
The Northwest, centered again around, to me, around John Muir High School, culturally, and now Lincoln Avenue, where Muir is got some nice restaurants and stuff. And the Northwest, with a sort of capital N, was a very proud African American and now perhaps mostly Latino neighborhood. And but people also, a lot of white folks were afraid of going up there. and didn't go up there very much. And now you'll find people who are moving because the real estate's more affordable, and people will moving from the west side or Los Feliz, and they'll see a great little bungalow on Alberta Street or something, and they go, "This is great." Well, several years ago, that would have been considered, "Oh my God, you're moving into gang territory." And well, from the time I was in junior high, there's been Crips and there's been Bloods in Pasadena, and of course many Latino gangs. It's true, and it's a different part of the city. Yeah.
I think in the mid 90s, my family looked at places in Northwest Pasadena just because the affordability, and someone came up to me and said, "You don't want to live here." And I had no idea of the area. We're just looking around, walking around, and that was the first time in my life that I experienced something like that. Someone saying, I don't think they were being rude. I think they were honest.
Yeah.
And that was I always remember that.
And it has been, still a fight in City Hall and for the city council people who represent it. There was a long fight to get parks and to have the streets kept up as well, and the curb strips and all that stuff. It was a neglected part of the city historically by the all-white the city administration and city council. And that was another huge fight, was to get the council districts that I've referred to several times as we've talked, made geographic. Because back when there was almost as many people who weren't white here in the 20s and 30s as there are now, and yet there was never any people of color on the council, the Board of City Directors then, because the overall vote wiped that out. You had to have by district voting to change the politics of the city, and thankfully we did.
So there has been that improvement.
Yes, I definitely think that's an improvement.
How do you look at Pasadena today? Do you like the way it's developed, the changes it's gone through?
Absolutely. So many of them. We take old Pasadena for granted now, but in my journalism career, that's when, from the beginning of it till now, is I have seen the development of a place where there were porno theaters and sort of a mini Skid Row turn into the fancy retail and dining area we know and love, and sometimes think has too many chain stores. Today, it's, and still super things are happening. Boy, the one good thing that's come out of this damn pandemic is sidewalk and parking place dining. I mean, the restaurants on Green Street are just loving it. The little French restaurant Entre Nous has got twice as many, maybe more than twice as many seats for free, and they're not paying rent on them now that they've got that sidewalk.
And just the little alleys, like
alleys are great.
Mills Alley, I think is the name of it.
Yeah. Super, super fun walking through there and seeing everybody outside there. And Maestro, that fantastic Oaxacan up on Union, they've got a little alley beside it, and it's a really nice place to sit outside. And so that has been great for Pasadena. So old Pasadena is, what a success story.
Yeah.
Now, I like old Pasadena, but some criticism I have heard is that, well, as you said, kind of the chain store, Tiffany's versus Goldstein's Bagels, or, that kind of thing it loses a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah,
of that
but
kind
clearly
of feel.
people, so I'm a snob about it, and old Pasadena, nobody local ever goes there anymore, is that what some of us say, but people flock there, and so it's a lot of the people are from Temple City and from West Covina and places that don't have our kind of downtown, and so that's fine. I enjoy going to other places in Pasadena where you can park and walk more easily, but as well. But I like Old Pas too.
Well, you mentioned a lot of places in there, and we're going to ask you to narrow them down to just a few, so we can get to know some of your favorite places in the San Gabriel Valley.
So, Larry, the SGV3, what are some of your favorites?
Well, I thought about it, and you guys had asked me about it, and the ones I came with, I'm going to stick to Pasadena because I'm just such a Pasadena boy. And so the Arroyo Seco, number one. I live over in the Linda Vista neighborhood, and I a door over from the edge of the arroyo, and I run down there on the paths, and I play golf at the Brookside Golf Course, and I go to the Rose Bowl game, and I love the Arroyo Seco. Absolutely tremendous cultural, historical, recreational resource.
Yeah.
I can go hiking from my house, and I live in the city. So first that. Mm-hmm. Then I'm going to do a weird twofer because Raymond Avenue, North Raymond Avenue, has two of my favorite establishments. Really three. I'll go into the third in a sec. But I love the restaurant Osawa, which is a Japanese restaurant. Apparently you know it. It's the best sushi and the realest Japanese, and I feel great when I'm there. I love the sushi bar. They haven't brought the sushi bar back yet, but you can eat inside. It never was the same getting takeout sushi over the lockdown. It was disappointing, but I wanted to support Osawa. Yep. But right up, connecting in my mind to Osawa is the Everson Royce wine shop, which also before the pandemic had tastings Friday nights, and always had the bar open in there. And Joe and the team who run that it's like my local, but it's a wine store, and you can also buy mezcal there. And in between those two things, so I'm making those my number two. Osawa and Everson Royce, but in between those two things is a great cultural institution that is sometimes overlooked in a town that has the Norton Simon and has the Huntington right across the street from Pasadena, but is the Armory Center for the Arts, which is a museum and a gallery, and it's also inherited the old art workshops, which was at the old Pasadena Art Museum, where the Norton Simon is now, and which is children's and adults classes, art classes, and it's very fine contemporary art shows that are allied, that came out of the old Baxter Art Gallery at Caltech. It's sort of the inheritor of that tradition, and its late curator Jay Bololi worked at both places. So that's it. The Arroyo and Osawa and Everson Royce and the Armory Center for the Arts are my big three for the SGV.
Yeah, no, those are great places. We've had Arroyo Seco mentioned before. I believe even Osawa.
I don't think so, but we just had dinner there last week.
That's really?
Yeah,
right. Super.
It's a place that a lot of people love. I know it's highly recommended.
Yeah, and I love restaurants personally, but that just stands out.
Yeah, I just feel when I came here, you're a fourth generation, I'm a first generation, but I have just been so impressed from the day I moved here with Pasadena, and I really just put it in the highest scheme of places that a person could be lucky enough to live in. I mean, it's just culturally and in terms of the beauty, but the access to nature, as you said, you've got the hills.
I haven't even talked about the mountains. I mean, I sort of the Arroyo stands.
And you grew up, you lived right at right near
across the street. Yeah, where I grew up in Altadena was right below Echo Mountain, and so I grew up hiking there. All we had to do was walk across Loma Alta, and we were in the National Forest. So sort of a scrubby area, the National Forest, but you go up Rubio Canyon, and it's waterfall used to be there at least, and it's great hiking. So really lucky to have those mountains up there, and the Bobcat Fire. We drove up. My wife and I drove up to the Highway 2. Took a little hike a couple weeks ago, and man, the Bobcat really ravaged everything behind Mount Wilson and all the way up to Waterman, and of course it burned all the way to the desert.
Oh, you took the two all the way to Waterman?
Yeah, we stopped right at Waterman and turned around, and
wow.
The highway is open to there, and it is just burned out all around Newcomb's Ranch and stuff. Yeah.
Wow, that's awful.
It's rough, but forests, especially our forests, grow back, and it's always going to be a fantastic resource for LA and Pasadena's closest.
Yeah. Conifers actually need fire to help them propagate again. which is interesting. I just recently learned that.
To get the seeds
That's
out.
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it will recover, and it's never going to be the redwoods or anything, but there are mountains with our sort of chaparral.
Sure. Well, Larry, thank you so much for sharing, your journey and all the things that you've experienced in your career. What's on the horizon for you? What are you looking forward to next?
I am looking forward to being able to travel again. And I am traveling a little bit this summer. I went surfing in Hawaii in April, and after they raised quarantine there, and I'm going back east for a wedding in upstate New York, and I'm going to actually work from New York for a week because these days, in the newspaper business, and we've proved it in this pandemic and remote work, that have laptop will travel. And, when I've got my laptop with me, I've got all the software we use in laying out the opinion pages at work, and I can really be anywhere. So, but I really love going to places like Spain and Scotland, two of my favorite places. And I have a Spain-Scotland trip planned, and I want to travel more in the sort of later years of my work. I haven't decided exactly when to retire, but retirement is in the offing. I'm 65 years old. I get out of there quick and spend more time in the Highlands of Scotland.
Nice. Well, thank you again for being here with us, and
thank you, Russell,
for sharing your story. I really appreciate it, and it's interesting to hear someone who's been around Pasadena and seen all the changes and describe them and share them all with us. So
unfortunately, we have to end it after an hour, but there would be so much more of interest and value.
I'm probably full of more baloney stories if you want to have me back.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for having
Definitely.
me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks again for the listeners for tuning in and spending this time with us. You can always share your comments with us online at sgvmasterkey.com. We appreciate it. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe. And we'll see you again next week with another guest.
Thanks for checking out another episode of the SGV Master Key. You can find the full back catalog of the SGV Master Key at sgvmasterkey.com and wherever you get your podcasts. This show was produced and edited by Russell Mono and Victoria Allers of Kind Monster Productions. Thanks again for listening or watching. We'll see you again real soon in the next episode.
Nice mother. No, kind mother.